Asif, welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Space history is a very refreshing subject, I would say. I am a very big fan of, historical perspective of the whole space sector. What got you into space history and there's not many people who I know who are professors of history who also study space.
This is true. It's not a terribly large field, but I think my interest was probably at a very young age, trying to understand. Of course, I was interested in contemporary events as they were happening as a young boy, but I was also interested in how things came to be. So that naturally led me to look at at the time the leading space programs were the American space program and the Russian program. So I sort of gravitated, I bought a lot of books and things like that, and got very captivated by these amazing characters in the history of space, which is really a very, very, although it's a story of technology, it's a story of human action. And so that was very much captivating to me. I'd always been interested in science and engineering. I have a degree in electrical engineering. So of course, I was interested in the actual engineering part, but it was also interesting to see how we got here. And so that's how I sort of ended up in this position.
And of course, then you go on to also research a bit on the Indian space program. How did you stumble on that?
Yeah, this is more of a recent thing. As you may know, most of my early work was on the Russian Soviet space program. But more recently, I got interested. I'd been spending some time in India with family. And so I just got interested in, and we were staying in Bangalore. So, I got interested just generally in the Indian space program. I think the main thing that drew me, of course, was that it seemed to be really taking off. My interest took off around the year 2000. I was really fascinated by all of ISRO's achievements, and it suddenly struck me, how did all this happen, in India? So at that time, I picked up a book you may know a book by a journalist named Gopal Raj, who wrote a fantastic book on the early Indian space program, and that book really opened up so much of this story to me. So, and then of course the next step as a historian is to dig deeper, and so that's how I got to get to the next step, to dig deeper and try to tell stories that are interesting. So
yeah, Gopal is a pretty good friend of mine, and it's very, very hard to get him to be on a podcast episode.
Yeah, he's an incredibly knowledgeable person and a great writer. I really owe him a lot of debt because besides his book, which is fabulous and I highly recommend it, he himself, I've spent some time with him in India, and he's just a font of knowledge and insight, and he's just a fascinating person. I hope he continues to write more, actually. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So from your papers, as I went through them, there's this very unique, event that happened with ISRO coming out with some of the publications from either the ISRO side itself or, some of the ISRO early personnel writing their memoirs or things like that. That's only a very recent phenomena.
Yeah, I agree. This is a recent phenomenon. I think there's probably a couple of reasons behind that. One is that ISRO has existed long enough, so it is now looking back on its own history, so to speak. It was a very young organization for a long time, but now that it has a lengthy history, it's now time to reflect backwards. So I think that was one motivation. But the second was many of the sort of what I call old timers from the 60s and 70s are reaching an age where they are feeling like they want to reflect back on their own achievements. So there have been a number of memoirs that have come out in the last 10 years or so, which have been added a lot to our understanding of the early days. Which are widely available. And so I think there's been a kind of double, both institutionally an interest, but also personal memoirs have contributed to our understanding.
And especially in the Indian context, I'm really fascinated with the character of Sarabhai. It's almost like, one man who is at the right time, at the right place, with the right connections, with the right background.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, yeah.
And, you talk about Sarabhai in your own papers quite extensively. You talk about some of the conversations on how the early collaborations happened between him and the others and so on. But I always wondered, what really led Sarabhai to think about using space as a tool in societal benefit? So was there any specific research done on his ideas itself?
Uh, yeah, it is an interesting question. How was Sarabhai drawn to space because, as you know, he was a cosmic ray physicist, but he also, after his studies in Great Britain, he came back to India around the time of independence, and he founded many institutions, which were some of them were obviously science related, but not all of them. I mean, he was very involved in the industrial activity in Ahmedabad and so on and so forth. But I think I think we see a kind of obviously his interest in cosmic rays meant that he was somewhat familiar with things, so to speak, cosmic and space related. But I think we really see the flowering of that interest after the Russian launch of Sputnik in 1957, and you see some of his interest also sort of gravitate toward direction. I would say one thing that I would add is that he was a figure, I think, who's interested in the most advanced technologies and sciences just by, I think his nature was I think he was attracted to cutting edge things. So space was a natural domain for him to be interested in because of that. And we see that particularly in the late 50s, early 60s, he's starting to imagine what India can do in terms of a space program. But I think the trigger, if you will, was really Sputnik. And for many people, I don't think, not just for him, because it opened up the possibility, oh, here we are in the new space age. What's going to happen? How can I contribute? How can my country contribute? So Sarabhai, I think, has a kind of dual vision. I think he was always interested in his own place in all of this as a very smart institution builder. He wanted to be a part of it. But I think a second part of it is also he was a nation builder in the sense that he was part of the project of building up India. He was very invested in that project. Both of those things coincided and overlapped in this space business, I think. And that's what I think set him off.
The other question that I always have in my mind is, was there any other person, who was as connected as Sarabhai politically, as well trained as a scientist, and coming from a developing country, who sold this idea of space to their political leadership then? And I fail to recognize anyone outside of, let's say, China in the
Yeah,
developing world at that time.
I think you're right. Sarabhai was very unique because he was the embodiment of a number of different things. If he just had one or two of these things, he might not have succeeded. But he had a whole set of things working in his favor. One, obviously, he was a very accomplished scientist. Number two, he was an institution builder. Number three, he was well connected to the elites of Indian governance and society. So I think, and number four, he was also wealthy. So I think all of these things worked in his favor. Um, and I would add a few other things. He was definitely visionary in the sense that he was able to translate the the science to a public, because that's also very important for these kinds of figures. You can't just live in your little world. You have to be able to really appeal to a broader public. And if you read his writings from the 60s, they're very appealing and accessible to regular people. You don't have to be a space scientist to understand that. In terms of other people in other countries, you're right. I think the most obvious parallel that I can see is probably Xian Zhushen, who was the Chinese, some consider the founder of the Chinese space program. Very sort of interesting and fascinating life, very different life than Sarabhai. But like Sarabhai, he was extremely smart and accomplished as a scientist. He was also a very good institution builder, a very good manager, and from what I understand, an inspirational figure. So he, as you may know, he worked and was educated for a long time in the United States at the California Institute of Technology at Caltech and also at MIT. And then he was a very key figure in the early days of the US rocket program at Jet Propulsion Lab. One of the top one or two people in the rocket program in the U.S. but for a variety of political reasons, he was essentially forced back to China in the 50s, and he founds the Chinese space program. And so I think there is a kind of some parallels I think we would see. Uh, Chiang's life was, of course, ended up, he left, he wasn't very deeply involved in the space program after the initial decade or so. And he becomes a writer, and he gets involved in many other national projects. But I think these kinds of figures we see in many other national contexts. For example, Werner von Braun, who's the German scientist who came to the U.S., Sergei Korolev, the Russian scientist. So there are other figures like this. They're all, I don't want to generalize, they're all same, but they played a very key role in galvanizing and mobilizing a lot of people. Sarabhai was definitely one in India.
Yeah, and essentially, I don't see any such figure existing today who have the same kind of clout, both as a scientific person and as a person who can have some kind of influence on political leadership towards science policy making in India anymore.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't know anybody myself at that level. These kinds of things are very rare. I don't think these are very common. People, but perhaps there's somebody coming up in the next generation. It's hard to say, but certainly then the post, it's not that I don't want to minimize the accomplishments of people who came after Sarabhai, especially people like, Satish Dhawan, and who was very crucial. But I don't see anybody who's, sort of charismatic in the double sense of the word, both as a scientist / engineer and as a public figure, like somebody inspirational. That's a rare thing. You usually have one or the other. The combination of those is not very common.
Yeah, with a lot of people who I have spoken to who work directly with Satish Dhawan call him like a man of process, and the Sarabhai as the visionary who put in place the vision. So that kind of complemented, each other's stints as then the person who set the vision and then the person who built the processes on top to meet that vision.
Yeah, I agree. I think those generalizations are vaguely true. I think in the sense that when Sarabhai was in charge in the 1960s, really, that's when the vision was necessary. He also laid down this blueprint for ISRO, which was, we're going to do a space program that is directed towards developing our own people rather than some sort of fancy stunt-making space program. That was his vision. And in terms of managerial roles, I've heard Sarabhai was rather, informal, somewhat chaotic. People were sort of doing their own thing in this sort of ad hoc way. Satish Dhawan came along at a time when the ISRO needed somebody to really straighten things out. The SLV-3, the first launch vehicle, was being developed in the 70s, and you need enormously complicated. It's an enormously complicated project. You need very clear management. He sort of introduced this project-driven management at ISRO. So his role can't be minimized. Incredible, I think. But he didn't have necessarily the star power that Sarabhai had, and maybe that's what was necessary in the 70s. Somebody sort of get down to the business of doing the actual engineering. So they were the right people at the right time, I think.
And in your papers, you actually, one of the things that I really liked is you talk extensively about Tumba and the selection of Tumba, and the conversations around convincing people in the US, in the Soviet Union, in France, and other places to be a participant.
Yeah.
And it's always fascinating to see that a person from India is talking to advanced countries who are building these missiles and satellites and telling them do something here in India where we can collaborate. So I would love to have you describe this whole thing that you write in your paper, so that people can get a sense of what was really the background to Tumba itself, because we all celebrate Tumba. Everybody knows about Tumba in India. Most of the people who know the space program, but hardly anyone really knows about the background conversations around it.
Yeah. No, the creation of Tumba is a very very fascinating process and very complicated. It just didn't appear out of anywhere or nowhere. And the process involves many different players in across the world. This is why my article is called "The Global Creation of Tumba," because it did really involve so many different players. At the core of it is, of course, Sarabhai and also Homi Bhabha, who was head of the Atomic Energy Commission, another very fascinating and brilliant scientist. So I think these guys, I think particularly Sarabhai wanted to essentially create um, a space program in India. And I think his vision was that in order to do that, we'd really have to have the infrastructure and the expertise within India rather than, somewhere else. And how do you do that? Well, you create maybe a launch base or something that has a kind of an international flavor so that people come to it. At the time in the early 60s, when he had this idea, he also wanted to do some other things too, like create a communications satellite station and so forth. But at the time, India didn't have necessarily the technological infrastructure or anything really to create this. So what he did was he canvassed and mobilized a bunch of his international contacts, the most critical being in the United States with NASA. And he went to NASA, I think the first time in 1961. And he essentially, it took a while, but he engineered essentially an agreement that NASA would provide some infrastructure, including an actual rocket, which they would launch from India. And the sort of the carrot, if you will, was the attractive part of this was he offered India as a place to study a particular geomagnetic phenomenon, this sort of equatorial electrojet, which only was observable near the equator of the Earth. And in South India, of course, the equator passes through Kerala. And so he offered this as a kind of tantalizing possibility to a number of physicists, saying, look, you guys come to India, you can study this. You don't have to go to have ships out in the middle of the ocean. We have an actual location somewhere in Kerala. We can do this. So that got scientists involved. NASA found this sort of sufficiently tantalizing. But again, he was very, I think, Sarabhai was very strategic. He didn't want to depend on one set of partners, in this case, the US. He went to the Soviet Union, he went to Moscow also in 1961, and had some talks with them about what they could offer. And eventually, the Soviets offered a number of other types of infrastructure, like a computer and helicopters and things like that. He went to France at the time, which had a pretty good rocket program, and he sort of engineered another agreement to have them deliver not only rockets but also payloads, actually an actual sodium experiment, which would be a simple but elegant little experiment to study phenomenon in the upper atmosphere. Essentially, it released a sodium cloud as the rocket went up to the atmosphere, and you study the direction. It was sort of, the cloud is dispersed, and you study the directionality of it. And so it's a very simple but elegant experiment. And a French scientist named Jacques Plamont had already used the sodium cloud in Algeria with French rockets. So it was already a well-tested thing. He also, and I think this was another very critical part, he went to the United Nations. Why did he go to the United Nations? Because I think at the time there might have been some perception that, why is India collaborating with Americans or Russians? This is not, India is officially non-aligned at this time. So I think the United Nations gave it this sort of stamp of, oh, this is for global scientific development. This is not about any one side of the Cold War. So he went to the UN, and essentially, I'm shortening a long story, but he was very strategic. He suggested the UN form a committee to study the possibility of organizing a launch base somewhere in those days. We used to call it the Third World. And so and this committee went to study where could they sort of organize this base. And but they did a lot of studies, but the key issue was Sarabhai himself was a key figure on this committee. And so he was able to shape the committee's decision, and the committee eventually chose Tumba or at the time it's India, so somewhere in the south of India, to have the launch base. So eventually the United Nations gave its stamp. This is going to be the international site. All countries are welcome here. All countries, when they bring their infrastructure, it's going to be free of charge. And if they bring something, they have to leave it there. And so all of these things are the pieces of the puzzle that come together. And then eventually the final part of this story is, of course, the actual selection of Tumba. And this is, he invited a number of NASA representatives, including a guy named Larry Cahill, who was a NASA engineer who had worked at the NASA site in Wallops Island in Virginia, which was a very uh, uh, sort of active rocket launch site. Not many people know about it, but it's a small site. So what Larry Cahill did was he looked at reproducing this site in Virginia in India. And so his expertise was very crucial. A number of Indians obviously contributed to it, like Praful Bhavsar and Chitnis and K.R. Ramanathan, and a number of other people I forget, but everybody sort of sat there and figured out what's the best place to study this phenomena of the equatorial electrojet, and they landed on Tumba. And so that's how essentially by 1964, 65, uh, Sarabhai is already launching rockets, French rockets, and American rockets from Tumba. But the pieces, the actual putting this puzzle together was an enormous amount of work. He traveled globally. Every month almost he was traveling somewhere across the globe. None of this was really known because all this was all in the background. And I think it was a very exciting project for me to uncover these, looking through his papers and trying to figure out what plane, what flight he was going to, why was he going to Moscow? Next thing he's going to Washington, next thing he's going to Paris. And so he was his energy was incredible in especially 62, 63. And then finally these accords are signed, and the eventually in 68, as you probably know, there's a very big ceremony where the PM Indira Gandhi comes, the United Nations representative comes, and Tumba becomes officially an international base to study outer space. But all the groundwork was laid by Sarabhai as a kind of jet-setting organizational project in the early 60s. A phenomenally successful project, I think, because it's rare. It was rare in the 1960s to have Russians and Americans standing side by side, launching a rocket. These were enemies, but at Tumba, they would both come. Eventually, the Russians also brought their own rockets, which was the M100 rocket, the meteorological rocket. And they launched hundreds and hundreds of these from Tumba. And so they were French rockets, American rockets, Soviet rockets, and of course, eventually Indian rockets. And one can imagine the infrastructure that is built up in Tumba because of all of this activity and the expertise which is gained by young Indian engineers who were watching all this, sort of soaking up all this expertise and knowledge. And just I think like a school. It's like a university of rockets, if you will, Tumba. And it was possible because Sarabhai essentially set it up like a rotating international faculty of people who were coming. It's a very brilliant, I think, project. And I think by the 70s, Indian scientists and engineers could essentially migrate from that model to a more indigenous domestic model. But that part in the 60s was crucial for that evolution to happen. By the time Satish Dhawan takes over, there is a kind of a core competence already to, for example, build the SLV-3 under Kalam. So, but the 60s, I think, was crucial because it was a kind of education for the Indian scientific community.
What is fascinating for me in all of this is also that all the people who Sarabhai handpicked and even sent them to the US through, like government-sponsored programs, or had this collaboration with MIT or with NASA and so on, they all were committed to the cause and, kind of returned back to India and, finished their careers in ISRO mostly. And there was very little churn in terms of the brain drain. With any of these engineers could have easily said, now I have all the tools and I have all the knowledge, and I've gotten a very lucrative offer with an American company or a European company, and could have possibly migrated.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. I mean, you have to understand this was also, I think, the exception, because for most, there was a massive number of there was a lot of Indian immigration to the US in the 1960s. Highly skilled Indians who were mostly doctors who came in the mid to late 1960s, and they immigrated and they settled down in the States, and their kids and their grandkids are now Americans here in the US. But this particular group of space guys, I don't think they would call themselves space guys in the 60s, all went back to India. And they, they had, beginning with Praful Bhavsar, who was at the University of Minnesota, but also a number of people who were at MIT and elite institutions here, like MIT and Caltech, um, all went back to India to work on the, Sarabhai sent them, said, you go there, you do these little trips, you missions, maybe do some studies, but you come back, and they all came back. So I think it is a interesting sociological study, and so it could be, why or what motivated these guys to come back. But they did, and I think that they formed the kind of brain core of ISRO. Whereas I think with other, if you want to compare it with other disciplines like medicine, for example, there was probably a brain drain because, especially people, there's a generation of people who came to the U.S. in the '60s that stayed here, and so I think it is an interesting thing. And I don't know the data so well, but I think this is something that I'd like to follow up in the book that I want to write, is do a sociological study of who came and from what part of India. There's a kind of, this is speculation mostly from on my part, but it's a lot of South Indians. And I think, I wonder if that had something to do with their, both their ability and their interest to come back to India instead of staying in the US. Perhaps not, I don't know. But I think it might be worth a study at least, from which part of India most of the people ISRO, early ISRO, not now, but early ISRO from, there's this joke, perhaps you've heard, ISRO stands for Idlis Sambar Rasam Organization. And I think that's came from the sort of stereotype that maybe it's a lot of South Indians, but I don't know if statistically this is true or not.
Yeah, that's the first time that I'm hearing that, but it's really nice to know as well. So one of the great angles that you cover in your writing is this culture and the social angle of these Indian scientists going to the US, and them being around uh, the cultural kind of
Yeah,
the complexities around the US environment, with the Martin Luther King and the whole
yeah,
civil
yeah,
issues going on. So
yeah,
it's really fascinating that I think you're the only one that I know who has written about this particular angle, and how
yeah.
the perception of Indian scientists in US during this time.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, again, this is something I want to pursue further, but many Indian scientists came to the US in the 60s at a time of great racial strife and conflict. As these the struggle for civil rights in the U.S. was led by Martin Luther King Jr. And at the very moment, I think, when there was so much sort of racial strife here in the U.S., Indian engineers came initially to Virginia, and a small group came sometime in '62 or '63. I'm forgetting the exact date, and then further on there were many more trips. But I was looking through the newspapers, the local newspapers, and how in America, in this town in Virginia, and they were sort of there's I mean, they sort of were seen as both very exotic. Who are these brown people, and because they'd never seen anything like this, But also, there's definitely some racist sort of behavior too. Like, and this is, I've heard that they had trouble getting haircuts and things like that because people in Virginia wouldn't give them haircuts because they weren't white. But I've also talked to a couple of them who came, and they've written memoirs, of course. In general, I think they had a fairly okay experience, but I think they had somehow ended up in a very sort of critically uh, a time of great conflict in the U.S. So I think they faced some of that, and of course, having talked to some of the Indians who did immigrate in the '60s, they faced a lot of racism too. Undoubtedly, in the U.S., this was a very different time than now, and so I think, by and large, I think most of them were happy to go back to India, at least after their training programs. But I think they did. I don't think there was any kind of seriously negative thing that happened, but just more of a general feeling that they were outsiders and never seen as completely assimilated.
Do you think that may be a very big factor in a lot of these engineers going back to India?
Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, especially the ones who came in those extreme early days. They had trouble. If you imagine trying to find, vegetarian food in Virginia, it's in 1963 when everybody's eating meat and everything. So I think I've heard that there were some problems with finding food to eat. So I think there was a lot of cultural issues. I think, and again, this is anecdotal, but I've heard some didn't feel very much welcome here in the U.S. Um, and others did, and the experiences varied, but I think some of the impetus to go back, uh, undoubtedly some of it was just perhaps, the pull of your motherland, but some of it may have been an experience that was negative in the U.S.
And going back to Sarabhai, once he set up Tumba as a platform, and then there's the UN and UniSpace happening, and there's of course this massive statement that everybody quotes saying India will be second to none in space applications for societal development. Is there
Right.
a background to where he picked up this particular positioning of India pursuing space activities?
Yeah, I think Sarabhai's vision of space was rather different than what's coming out of U.S. and Russia, which is much more spectacular and ambitious. I think Sarabhai's vision probably emerged from two or three different sources. One is just a pragmatic sense that, look, we're behind the game in space. What can we do? We can't send out things to Mars and the moon, but we can do some more modest things. And I think, which relates to the second issue, which is that I think, and because Sarabhai was a smart person, he knew how to essentially uh, play the system, so to speak. And I don't mean in a negative way. He just knew because he was a skilled person in bureaucracies. If you what's India in the 1950s and 60s is kind of a developing nation. There's lots of problems with income inequality, poverty, agriculture. So I think he wanted to reorient. He says, look, if we want to adopt the most cutting edge of technologies, and at the time there was nuclear energy, there was space, and then there was computing. And all of three of them, by the way, under Baba, there was um, quite a quite a lot of investment made in all three areas. Space, of course, with Incospar, the nuclear stuff under the Atomic Energy Commission, and then the computing stuff. Baba started the Electronics Committee, and so I think they were already thinking, what can we do? But Sarabhai's thinking was, people are not gonna buy this space stuff in India. India is after all a democracy, and so there has to be some buy-in by the people. And I think this was a kind of very strategic, clever reformulation of the problem. Is that I think I've written this before. The question was always put, well, why does India need a space program? Because there's so much poverty here. And he inverted the question and said, well, India needs a space program precisely because there's so much poverty here, because a space program can generate innovations and benefits that will lift all these poor people up from poverty. And so he made that the core of his vision by remote sensing, weather research, all sorts of communication issues, education. And so he sort of made those the center of his space vision, because India could not afford, and I don't mean that in terms of money, but it couldn't take the risk of investing into lunar programs and space science issues, because that's not the priority of India in 1965. The priority is to just become a developed nation. So I think so what I'm trying to say is that his marriage of space with these kinds of development goals is a strategic move to make space possible within India. Instead of saying space for all this spectacular stuff, let's just make space for us. And finally, I would say, and he was influenced and shaped by what historians call modernization theory, which was basically a kind of theory proposed by a number of American economists who said that in order for the third world to develop, they had to essentially adopt modern technology, and then through some certain stages they would develop. And so I think he adopted that kind of vision that technology is the solution to all of this, rather than, let's say, social programs or other kinds of things. So he sort of bought into that. So I think all of this stuff fed into his vision. And you may be familiar, in 1970, he is one of the sort of his legacy, really, because he died the year after they issued this sort of ISRO manifesto. You know, what are we going to do from 1970 to 1980? And that document is really lays out his vision. You know, like, we're going to do all this remote sensing, we're going to do agricultural stuff, we're going to do educational stuff and communication stuff, and there's nothing in there about anything else. You know, it's not like, oh, we're going to, you know, land a robot on the moon or something. It's pretty clear. Like, India needs a space program to develop its own people.
Yeah, indeed. One of the interesting conversations that I had around this is actually with Jacques Blameau, who was,
Mm-hmm.
Sarabhai's early collaborator from France. Uh,
Yes.
and Blameau was in India, I think 2016, the last time, before he had a fall, and then I guess
Yeah.
last year he passed away, this year, I guess.
Yes.
uh, and I was asking Blameau about his visits to India, starting from I think early 1960s. He was in India already,
Right.
visiting India. And essentially, when I met him, he said, look, he told me, like, I've been in India for like every year for the last 50 years or something like that. And
Wow.
yeah, and the fun thing that he told me is that he stayed in Bangalore at the same hotel for like 50 years.
Oh my God, that's crazy.
So essentially, I was asking Jack, what did you think of Sarabhai, given having met him, having been one of his very early collaborators, and having seen the evolution of the Indian space program and the Indian economy, and what he thought of Sarabhai selling him this dream of leapfrogging, using
Yes.
technology to be a developed country, and using space as a tool in leapfrogging towards a developed nation. And Jacques was told me, like, at the first instance I thought it was complete bullshit. But now that I see it, I believe what he said was perhaps true.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of people doubted Sarabhai, in the 60s, because they just like, well, yeah, blah, blah, blah. It's like he's going to say a lot of stuff. But it turns out that, uh, the kind of vision that he had was a very reasoned, sensible one. And I don't think he was trying to be, utopian and all this other stuff. In fact, that this is precisely the opposite. That, let's be reasonable on what we can do. I don't, and he was ambitious too, and I think maybe the ambition was the one that Blamont is responding to. Like, this guy is not kidding around. This guy wants to build India's first domestic rocket satellite launch vehicle. That was a very ambitious goal for a country in 1965. Very ambitious. At the time, besides the United States and Russia, 0 countries had done that. So I think Sarabhai is already talking about it. So I think. Well, the French actually joined in 1965. They were the third country. So I think um, but I think, yeah, I think there's a kind of sense that you might doubt him, what he's up to. Blamont is a very interesting character, and sad that he passed away. But because he's a big player, and if any, in the early history of the Indian space program, his name would be like a massive chapter, because he's everywhere. He orchestrated this um, treaty agreement in 1964 to deliver the Centaur sounding rockets to Tumba. But besides that, he was instrumental in many, many, many other ways through the last, until the 1990s, really, in terms of encouraging collaboration between ISRO and ESA, European Space Agency. So I think in many different ways, I think he was a very crucial character, and he was right there from the beginning. And Blamont, his memoirs, which have come out in French, are really fascinating, because he was in this, if you think about it, international network of people. Blamont was much like Sarabhai. There was he's another node which went globally to many different countries. And so these were giants, I think, Blamont, Sarabhai, and these figures that were global space players of the time.
Yeah, and I imagine, I always used to either, talk to him or email him, and he always used to respond. And even at the age of 90 years, he had a full-time office in his Paris headquarters of the French Space Agency.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I had the fortune of going there to meet him. I think in 2000, so a while back, 2009 or so, and we spent a number of hours there. I interviewed him about Sarabhai, and he gave me a lot of his papers, which was very nice, historical papers. But yeah, I think he's a fascinating character. I hope someday somebody writes a biography of Lamont.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, he did, contribute to a book that we edited on Indo-French collaboration. And it could be one of his, last writings that is available.
Oh, I see. That's great. I look forward to reading that.
Yeah, I'll send them across to you, definitely. And one of the things that you mentioned in your article, which is very interesting, that I thought was the protest that Blamont had for Tumba initially, where he landed in India and he saw a bunch of fishermen and nothing at all,
Yes.
and saying this is a useless place with useless people around.
Yes, he did. He had this very initial impression was very negative. I think he said something about people are lazy or something, but I think it was I just thought it was funny that but he sort of he had, even then he was thinking, well, if only these people would get to work, it would be great. So I think he was for something, I think, I don't exactly remember what, but his very first impression of right outside the airport, as they're putting their luggage in the car or something, was very negative. Something happened and he complained about it. But I think over the years it got better, I think. So yeah.
So, but finally, when I met him, the last time I met him, I asked him about this, saying, do you see the leapfrogging effect? And he said, yeah, I mean, I see it now in hindsight, but, looking back 50 years ago, one wouldn't have imagined the India that I visited in Tumba would be the India it is today.
Yeah, that's quite a quote, and amazing to see that change from in the space of not very long. In long historical terms, it was very quick. It took the United States, a century to develop from an agrarian country to an industrial one, primarily. But India and did this sort of movement extremely fast. So I think, yeah, and I think there's a lot of, sort of a note of caution that it's not like it was smooth sailing, but I think there's obviously a lot of ups and downs in this history, even in the history of science and technology in India, because truly the way in which, people see the history of recent history of India, let's say post-liberalization 90s, and after that as a kind of the growth and domination of the IT industry, which happened rather fast. But I think but prior to that, the movement seems very slow, 60s, 70s, 80s. But in fact, I think a lot of the bedrock and the groundwork was laid during that time. People tend to focus on the years since in the 90s and after that, but I think if you look at it in historical terms, the real groundwork was really set in the 60s and 70s, the really difficult one, the groundwork in terms of educating a generation, setting up good educational institutions, setting up the infrastructure of industry and so forth. And, there are ups and downs and everything, but I think that period is truly interesting to me because it has the real difficulties India faced are much more evident then, and I think more interesting. So, yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things that you cover, again, referring back to your work, which I also found very useful, is the INSAT system and the story around how the study for the INSAT system was put into place in MIT.
Yeah,
And from having read your work, Sarabhai was some sort of a guest faculty or a guest
yeah,
professor at
yeah.
MIT, and he could leverage his position there to convince the management to basically kind of do a study alongside Indian engineers in putting the INSAT system together.
Yeah, that's a very interesting story too, because already in the late 60s, Sarabhai commissioned a couple of studies to see what kind of a satellite India could build. Not the first one, but an advanced version of a satellite. This eventually becomes INSAT. So they did some preliminary groundwork studies, but in 1970, 69, 70, he basically, he had a visiting position. He was a visiting professor at MIT. So he would spend a few weeks, sometimes a few months every year at MIT. And through his connections there, essentially convinced a team at MIT to look into this problem. But I mean, this is a complicated story, but basically he managed to get quite a lot of funding for this study, and a lot of support from, of all people, the Pentagon. And so he for example, knew Robert McNamara, who had been the Secretary of the Air Force. So there's a kind of military connection. And eventually the study was done at a place called the Lincoln Labs, which is affiliated with MIT, but not technically under MIT. So, but it's called the MIT study. Anyway, the people at Lincoln Labs who did the study, along with a number of Indian engineers, including Y.S. Rajan, and I forget, a number of other people, came to MIT in 1969, and they spent about a year doing this study. And the study was released, and it was the first concrete study of a Indian satellite. So it was a joint study by MIT engineers and Indian engineers, overseen jointly also by MIT and Incospar. So I think, and then this study was also, as I said, sponsored by, had some links to the US military, because some of the technology, some of the engineers who worked on this project were actually working on classified projects for the US Air Force, so some satellite projects. So I think it's an interesting story about how I think Sarabhai was so well connected that he could leverage a lot of different pieces of this thing and put together, including connections to MIT, connections to Lincoln Labs, connections to the US Air Force, et cetera, et cetera. He could put it all together. And when the study was issued in 1970, and I managed to get a copy of it, I went to Lincoln Labs, into their archive, and looked at all the correspondence between Sarabhai and McNamara. And the study itself, which is a very, very thick book, which it's really fascinating because it's a very advanced satellite design that they come up with. Eventually, and this is the second part of the story, they had to, it was too ambitious in a way, and so they had to pull back a little bit. And then the INSAT study that they issue eventually comes to, it goes back to India, but there's a lot of bureaucratic infighting at the Indian government between various ministries, and the history of INSAT is really fascinating because Doordarshan, the All India Radio, All India TV, all of these people were very unhappy with many different things to do with INSAT. Eventually, the INSAT that is launched, I forget the exact date because I'm terrible with dates off the top of my head, but whenever, I think 1982, the first INSAT, I may be wrong, but it was a very much compromised version of the 1970 MIT report. But the people I've talked to, like Y.S. Rajan and other people, have said that that report was crucial to essentially producing the core competence of the team in terms of further development. Although the actual satellite was never built in its original conception, it had a huge influence in shaping further development of satellites in India. So I think that's an interesting story in itself.
Indeed, it's always fascinating, the whole journey to capture that, and I'm hoping to record an episode with Y.S. Rajan when I am in Bangalore next.
Yes, yes, yeah, he's another fascinating person, and he's like the history of ISRO is encapsulated in him in many ways, and a very a kind and generous person too. I think he's a font of all sorts of knowledge, partly because I think he was involved in a lot of by the 1980s, he was involved in management and policy setting. So I think that he's a really not only an important person in the history of ISRO, but also someone who has retained the memory of what had happened. But he was very young in 1970, but I think his and many other people's involvement in the MIT report were very crucial, I think.
So one of the things that is also extremely interesting is this parallels between the progress on the Indian space program and the Pakistani space program, because essentially from what I have read so far in all the writings, the offers of initial technology and initial collaborations were pretty much the same. And in fact, there were, I think, even pictures of Indian scientists working alongside
Mm-hmm.
Pakistani scientists in the US on the
Mm-hmm.
same bits and pieces. But it's interesting that the whole Indian side of uptake in terms of developing that further into full program bloomed into a fully functional space program. But this parallel is kind of very unique, and not many people have actually explored this in a fully fleshed out way, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, it hasn't been really looked at very much. And again, I was surprised to discover all this stuff because I wasn't really looking to study the Pakistani space program. But when I was in the archives, uh, Pakistan's name kept coming up, and I was like, "Well, this is interesting." And so I have a little bit of it in my article, but something in the future I want to sort of pursue. But yeah, the story, if I'll just summarize it very quickly, was that when NASA was collaborating with all these countries in the early 1960s, it one of the countries it collaborated was Pakistan, one was India, and these agreements happened very simultaneously, almost simultaneously, which was very striking to me. And so Pakistan, in fact, and this is the most striking part, was that they the in this, I think June of 1962, they launched their first rockets, basically these Nike Cajun rockets, similar to the one that were launched from Tumba in 1963. So basically, the whole sodium cloud experiment that people say, oh, this launch from Tumba inaugurated the Indian space program. Pakistanis did it like actually a year before, the exact same thing, and it's completely like disappeared from the historical record. But they had a very, very active rocket program at a place about 50 kilometers from Karachi on the coast, and this was a place called Samniami. And so they which was their version of Tumba, I guess, or I guess it would be reverse. Tumba was the Indian version of Samniani because Samniani came first. Anyway, they launched these under Abdus Salam, who was the physicist, um, Cambridge-educated physicist who would later go on to win the Nobel Prize in physics. Salam basically set up this whole project. Uh, and there was quite a lot of competition to have the UN sponsorship of the launch base. Was it going to be Sonmiani or was it going to be Tumba? And obviously, we know the end result of it was Tumba kind of, in quotes, won this competition. But for a long time, it wasn't clear it would be Tumba. And I think the key issue was Sarabhai was on this very important committee, and he managed to, I think, maybe shape some of the final decisions of it. What happens eventually is that, and it is striking the way in which the Pakistani rocket program essentially disappears. And I have no solid answer to this. There's a very active rocket program through the 60s. NASA launches many rockets from Sonmani, so do the Brits. And so I think it's not clear, but I think what has happened is, a couple of things happened basically. One was that essentially after 1971, when Pakistan essentially was beaten in this the war in which Bangladesh is born, that war Pakistan is essentially crushed by India, and I think that was a kind of wake up point for Pakistan to think about nuclear weapons. And so I think what happens is there's a reorientation of all these resources that are going to Sonmiani, and it's siphoned off into a kind of atomic weapons project. The second is that Salam himself is kind of gets sidelined in the 70s. And so if he was the only person essentially pushing this, but for a variety of reasons, he becomes kind of sidelined in Pakistani sort of elites. So his disappearance is really also crucial. I think for these reasons, the whole rocket program essentially collapses, and Pakistan puts all its eggs into the nuclear program, whereas India, I think, didn't have this kind of urgency. They had a very separate sort of atomic energy commission project, and I think they had people like Dawan who continued Sarabhai's vision. Um, and so I think for all these reasons, I think Pakistan essentially disappears. And as we know, Pakistan doesn't really have much of a space program to speak of. It has a very small satellite program, and maybe I'm not even sure if it has sounding rockets, but I think it had the promise of it. And this is the interesting part. If it had maintained its original plans from the 60s, I don't see why Pakistan couldn't have had a SLV-3 type project by the 80s, but it willfully abandoned it. And I think that's an interesting story in itself. Um, and so I think it is a very fascinating story to me, how these things were very parallel, but one collapses and one keeps going to what is now a globally sort of standing space program.
I hope there's more to uncover in the historical archives and more research to be done there in the future. But when you talked about accessing a lot of the historical archives, either in the US or India, how difficult is it to get access to such historical archives, both in the US and in India?
Yeah, access is a very big problem for historians studying the Indian space program. And I don't mean like there's people stopping you, but more that the records were never kept. ISRO, to my knowledge, never had a formal archive. So of course, lots of things from ISRO have been kept in the personal collections of many engineers. And as you know, Manoranjan Rao has made it he's done a very effective job of archiving a lot of information about the history of ISRO and publishing a lot. But for historians, it's not like NASA. NASA has a history office, which was formed at the very beginning of its creation, and it has an archive. So everything that NASA does gets eventually transferred to the archive, and you can go there, and it's supported by taxes. So it's a public service. You can go there and dig through stuff. Things are digitized. It's very impressive. Also, there's national archives in the U.S., which are easily accessible. I think there's a lot of impediments to study the Indian space program because Indian archives, both the National Archives in Delhi and ISRO's archives, were never sort of formally, nobody took the initiative in the 1960s, 70s, 80s to essentially keep a paper trail of all this, because for whatever reason, it never happened. So now if you want to study ISRO, the history of ISRO, one of the things that I did was I went to the National Archives in the US, which is there's a number of branches, but there's one in College Park, Maryland. And I started to dig the State Department's papers. And eventually I found thousands of letters between Sarabhai and NASA. And with this, you can reconstruct essentially what was going on between at least NASA and ISRO. And so, but it's only one part of the story, and one still needs, I think, a lot of the actual documents from the Indian side. And so what we've done essentially is to depend on memoirs. And there is, as we talked about, a rich memoir tradition in ISRO, which has been very useful to talk to people who are practitioners in the program. But memoirs also come with some, by definition, some problems, because memoirs are just people remembering things, and people often remember things wrong. So I think you have to sort of double check and triple check and do all sorts of other things before we say anything. For example, I'll tell you a small detail. When the first rocket was launched from Tumba, people always say, well, this was the French had the sodium payload, the Americans had the rocket, and the Russians had this computer and a helicopter and all this other. So I looked at it and found that actually the Russian computer and helicopter wasn't there. It actually came much later because I went to Russia to look at the Russian records, and I saw the delivery of this thing was much later. So these kinds of things, how you double check with other sources and hopefully able to tell a more true story.
Absolutely. And from the historical, again, archives and the historical perspective and the historians themselves, apart from a very niche set of authors, maybe Amrita Shah covering Sarabhai as a personality, or, Gopal Raj covering a little bit of the launch related history and the early teams developing the rockets, and perhaps some of the other writers like, SK Das, the former IAS officer,
Yes,
looking at some of the applications part of selling the applications bit to the people themselves. There's been
right.
very little people around the Indian historian base covering any of it in the space program. So, do you have any instances where you've seen historians of Indian origin looking at
Yeah.
the space program?
Well, I think you pointed out some of the already existing ones. I think I think the primary actor here is probably P.V. Manoranjan Rao. I think he's written a lot, and I think his work stands out as being very, very good. You mentioned Amrita Shah's biography of Sarabhai, which I think is very good. I highly recommend it. Um, uh, Gopal Raj's book is critical. It's a little bit old because it's about 20 years old, but I think quite still holds up. I don't know of any kind of younger scholars. I hope that there are people out there working, digging deeper. Um, I know that I would welcome anybody in India or elsewhere looking into all this stuff a bit deeper, because I think my biggest fear is that stuff is being lost, because um, we're losing as the further we get from these events, we're losing our capacity to really recover them. A lot of the stuff on the internet that's about ISRO or the Indian space program on the early days is just not correct. It's very superficial, and the same events get repeated over and over. And I fear that eventually uh, more nuanced perspectives will get lost. But I maintain hope that I think there will be some young people, I think, who will take to this. Um, I should mention that I'm drawing a blank. The gentleman in India, sorry, in the UK, who's written this book about some early pioneer of Indian rocketry.
Gurbir.
Gurbir, right? Gurbir is great, and I think he's another great contributor to building up this history. He's a really consummate researcher, so I think anything that he writes will be very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, again, I recorded a couple of episodes with Gurbir, and one specifically also on the story of Stephen Smith.
Yes. Well, what a amazing story. I mean, I don't think very much was known about it. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, the most fascinating part of that was that people in the philatelic world were involved so much with the rocketry.
Yeah, exactly. That's a story there in itself. Yeah, definitely.
So, what do you think is the problem in involving more students of history in space? Is it the funding? Is it that space history is not sexy enough, or?
Yeah, I think funding is definitely it. And generally um, I know probably in India, it's maybe not the first priority of students to study history, but I think in the U.S. at least, there are some good history of science programs here. And there are people who do very good work on the history of Indian science and technology. But none of them are really interested in space. I don't think it's a necessarily, I think it's an issue that people are interested in other things. I know there's quite a bit of work now to try and think about the history of the Indian IT industry. But I think space is one of those things that for, much of the attention on space history gets focused on the US and a little bit on Russia. And so I think people have, serious researchers are very small group who study non-US, non-Russia space history. I think that's part of it, because the space has been dominated by these two countries for decades. And so you can tell a pretty good story just by focusing on the two of them. And so I think only now, really, in the last 10 years, you're beginning to see a much more global books on the Chinese space program, for example. And I hope more books on the Indian space program too. There was there have been some, I think, there, I guess what there's some hope that I think I know some young graduate students who are interested in Indian space, but they've been sort of uh, maybe discouraged to go there because of the lack of archives in India. So I think that's been also part of it, that I think because they know that it's going to be problematic to go through archives in India, or there are no archives in India, they just decide to study something else. So that's also, I think, part of it.
Yeah, I hope that in the future we see more and more of this coming out, and there's of course a role for ISRO in all of this, in helping uncover more material and helping putting out more material in the public domain as well. So
Yeah,
unfortunately, ISRO does not have a space history office, or I don't know if they have any kind of such archival process in place, which also makes it available for the public.
yeah, I would hope ISRO reconsiders or considers this as a public service, because it is a public organization, and much like NASA, which has an obligation to share with the public what it does. And so I hope ISRO, it hasn't done it yet, but I hope ISRO uh, creates such an office, not just an actual history office, and begins the very difficult idea of sort of cataloging what they have, because someday soon people will regret not doing it, and it's already becoming too late. But I think it's still possible to start thinking about a history department, a history office. It doesn't have to be that big. Hire an archivist and maybe a couple of staff, and just start this project. So I think uh, it's it is an obligation of an organization that is doing such important work to catalog it and to think about, or preserving some of this work, because I think soon they'll be lost. And I hope ISRO does it. I don't know if they will, but I hope it does.
I hope so too, and I will, of course, make an attempt to raise some of these ideas to the current management. They have
Yeah.
been quite open to doing some of the new things, and one of the great things I think we have achieved through the New Space India community is this opening up of the launch space and creating a viewing gallery for many more people than what it was initially built for.
Oh, amazing. That's really great. That's exactly the kind of thing that will get the public more involved, right? I mean, I think I haven't followed this recent failure with the moon landing. My sense is that, uh, I don't know what's going on internally in ISRO, but it would be good for ISRO to share the findings very publicly, because although the landing didn't succeed, if ISRO shares what happened in great detail, I think it'll cultivate a kind of interest, a community behind it. Sometimes you have to share the failures with the successes, and my sense is that these are the kinds of things ISRO could probably expand.
Yeah, and it's a very cultural thing, and between generations, things are becoming very different from each other. Because if you looked at maybe the 80s and the 90s and even the early 2000s, when there was a lot
Yeah,
of launch failures were routine, things were just taken in stride, and people
yeah,
just moved on thinking this is science and we need to build stuff. And you had this period of maybe 15 years of just success, success, success.
yes, that is true. I think it was an immense successful path. And so I think maybe people were just shocked because, um, maybe there's an expectation from the public that everything succeeds, but actually space is very hard. And in fact, there's a lot of failures. It's just a part of how things go in space. So I think, yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I'm actually looking forward to, I know this, of course, the virus has changed a lot of the equation, but I'm excited to see what ISRO does in the next year or two, and how it bounces back from, especially the lunar program.
And especially if you are a space program and if you're not failing, it actually tells maybe that you're not pushing the boundaries enough.
Yeah, excellent point. That is also true, because there's a complacency that builds up. Well, we can do, you know, the PSLV is an incredibly successful launch, one of the most successful launch vehicles in the history. But I think every time you go to a new launch vehicle, it's always pushing the envelope, or a new spacecraft. Also with the human program that's coming up, that's definitely pushing the boundaries. So we'll see how that plays out.
So, in closing, is there any like new projects around the Indian space program that you're working on that is exciting and, you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, well, just that I'm working on an article on the first Indian, the Aryabhatta satellite, and that was launched in 1975 by the Russians. I've discovered a lot of basically a cache of documents uh, during my last trip to Moscow on this project, including many letters including all the way back to Sarabhai. Actually, I found letters in 1970, 71 proposing this project, and so hopefully we'll try to write up something about it, an article, and then eventually uh, my goal is to write a book about the Indian space program, maybe about 4 or 5 years from now, putting all of this together, maybe like a comprehensive history from the very early days up to the launch of the SLV-3 in 1980. So kind of a history leading up to that first launch. So that's my goal, to sort of put that together. But right now I'm putting little pieces in play, including this Aryabhatta satellite, which I think there's a lot of things I found which was surprised me about this cooperation. So hopefully I'll put that in print. So.
Yeah, I would love to do an episode, after you have the article published, and would love
Yeah.
to, do a follow-up episode with that as well. So Asif, thank you very much for taking a lot of the time in, doing this episode. It's been quite a lot of fascinating insights, and I'm sure that people would appreciate a lot of these perspectives, especially, thinking about it from a historian's perspective.
Oh yeah, no, it's my pleasure. It's always fun to talk about this. This is one of my favorite topics, so it's no problem at all. And good luck to you on the podcast. So.